It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm going to be here to walk you through the first part of our show today. We're going to start off with a little bit of industry news today, a couple things that I had noticed that I wanted to make sure everybody out there was aware of. Move on to the recap of last night's action, talk a little bit about the weather situation today, Vegas line, get into a little bit of the Vegas lines. I'll bring my co-host and our pitching guru, Josh Kalachi, on to discuss some of the pitching options that we have on today's slate. And we'll end it up by talking about some of the hitters before Josh and I give you the cornerstones of the guys that we're going to be building our lineups around. So let's get into it. First thing I wanted to talk about today, there's a couple points of industry news, a couple things that have happened that I think are positive. And I wanted to give all of the sites a little bit of credit for some of the things that they've done that I thought were very player friendly. Starting with FanDuel. FanDuel has finally started offering satellites that are actually meaningful satellites, meaning, some of you guys have noticed that the buy-ins for some of these big tournaments that they have, the Playboy qualifier, the Fantasy Baseball World Championship, these things are $500 buy-ins, $1,000, $1,065 buy-ins. So this is not something that the average player is going to be able to do with a minimal or a normal couple $100 in their bankroll. I know for myself, I can't take $500 shots every night at trying to qualify to go to the Playboy Mansion or trying to qualify to make it into the Fantasy Baseball World Championship. My bankroll just, isn't big enough for me to do that on a consistent basis and, still have money left over to play the way that I like to play and, have a good mix of the tournaments I like to be in. So what they started doing is offering satellites. There was a $5 22-person satellite last night that was giving out a $100 ticket to the Fantasy Baseball World Championship. They have a couple $25 satellites going tonight with like 40 or 50 people in it to win a $1,000 qualifier ticket. And getting these qualifier tickets is big because when they have a $25 qualifier, there are, thousands of people in these qualifiers. So in order for you to go and have a chance to go to the Playboy Mansion or have a chance to go out to Vegas to compete for the big money, you basically have to be the top roster out of, 2, 3, 4,000 rosters. And not that, basically I'm not going to say it's impossible because obviously somebody wins every night, but it's not a very easy thing to do. Even if you played it every single time they had it, if they had that tournament every day for the entire season, there's still a chance that most people who played it every day for the entire season are never going to wind up qualifying. But if you're able to get into a tournament that's only 40 or 50 people, that might be a $1,000 buy-in, you have a much better chance of really having a shot there. So if you can, find yourself on the top of a 40 or 50 person qualifier for $5 or $25, that gets you a chance to play in one of these big tournaments where, there are less entries, so your odds of winning are better. That's really what the small bankroll player will like to see or even a decent sized bankroll player would like to see, because I know for myself, I'm not going to be able to take those shots. But if I was able to get them for a little bit cheaper, I'm going to be in there. And that actually brings me to the next site I wanted to give kudos to, and that's Fantasy Aces. One of the things I love about Aces live qualifier, and one of the reasons why it's one of the ones I have been chasing this year, is that an Aces qualifier, you can get into satellite tournaments for $5, $11, $22, where you can win yourself one of these $109 tickets to the big qualifier on Friday. Now, if you're able to win yourself one of those tickets, you're going to be able to take a chance at, getting a live trip, going out to Angel Stadium and doing it for, basically, the amount of money that you would have spent on dinner if you went out that night to a nice restaurant. So for me, that's a more manageable, more reasonable shot that I would be able to take more often to, try to get some of those 109 tickets to take that big shot at getting to a live final. I try to play those $22 Aces qualifiers, a couple times a week with the hopes that, if I play it 5 times, I spend the same 109 with the hopes that I'll pick up at least one and maybe more qualifier tickets and, really give myself a chance to, go multiple ways when I get to the qualifier on Friday, and try to have that big roster that winds up taking me over the top. I also want to give a shout out to DraftKings. Basically, I had a big problem lately, because if you are somebody who likes to play more than one entry, or if you just basically are somebody who likes to play tournament style games, over on DraftKings, you either played the $3 moonshot for a chance to win, $5, 10, $20,000, depending on the night and how big it was, or you had to go all the way up to the $27 price point and play in the payoff pitch to have a chance to win that same kind of money. If you're somebody who plays in that, $10, $5, $10, $15 range, and you wanted to put in like 2 or 3 entries, well, that's basically $100 that you're laying out if you're playing in the payoff pitch. And if you put in 3 entries in the moonshot, well, the moonshot has 40,000 entries in it. So 3 entries out of 40,000 isn't really all that much. It doesn't give you a ton of coverage, based on what everybody else is going to be able to do in that tournament who's throwing more entries into it. What DraftKings decided to do is they have a tournament tonight. It's the first time I've ever seen it. They may have had it before, but this is the first time I've seen it tonight, which is why I wanted to give them kudos. They're having a $9 buy-in tournament called the Hot Corner that has a $50,000 prize pool in it. So there's going to be a big, pretty large prize for first place, and I think it's at a good price point. The reason why I like that $9 price point is when you're playing, like I said, when you're playing in the moonshot, a $50,000 moonshot is going to have like 16,000 entries in it, maybe even more than that, probably like 17 or 18,000 when you account for rake. So you need to be first or in the top 10 out of 17 or 18,000 entries in order to make any serious money in that. But in the DraftKings $9 one, there's only 6,000 entries. Now, again, it's not like I'm saying it's going to be easy to win this tournament or easy to get a top 10 here, but it's basically more than 3 times easier to get a top 10 here, and you're paying for the same prize pool. What they used to offer a smaller mini moonshot that was a $10,000 prize pool that had a smaller group of players in it. And they also offered a $12 check swing tournament that, basically had the same $10,000 prize pool. Now, not that that was bad, but the check swing was the $12. So if you were a $10 player, you were basically probably playing in that check swing tournament, but there really was no huge upside to it. There wasn't a chance for you to win $10,000 because the whole prize pool was only $10,000. With this $9 buy-in on the Hot Corner that they have, the $50,000 prize pool, you're able to give yourself a significant upside. If you do have that best roster on the day. I didn't check the payouts yet because I didn't enter any of the tournaments yet, but I would assume that the payout is probably somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, which again is a significant amount of money to be playing for if you only had to put up $10 to get into it. You're talking about a 250 to 500 time multiplier on your money, which is very significant in daily fantasy for something like this today. So I really like the fact that DK had put in a big prize pool tournament at that lower price point. And, if any of you guys are out there and you didn't like being able to win an entry in the 27, if you were only able to throw 1, well, now for that same $27 entries into the $9 Hot Corner and still give yourself a chance for a pretty big prize pool. So that's the industry news I wanted to talk about today. I'm very glad that the sites are listening to some of the players. Again, the large players are going to play in those big tournaments, and that's fine. But there's a lot of players in that mid-range who, are basically the lifeblood of these sites. The mid-range players like myself, like Josh, like some other people who, might have bankrolls in the low 4 digits are basically able to play in a lot of these tournaments that, aren't going to kill our bankroll, where if we were trying to go into $1,000 qualifier, or like last week when Aces bumped their qualifier up to $215, you price a lot of people out of the market that way. And what these sites really want to do is make sure that these tournaments are full and that there's enough people in them. So I definitely think that all 3 of these sites made positive steps in the right direction, and I wanted to just mention it and give them some kudos for it. So moving on from there, let's get into today's show. So let's talk a little bit about the recap from last night. Let's see. Last night was a small slate of games. We only had about 6 of them. I think there was one that was an early start game at 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock. I forget what it was. But there were a lot of high-scoring teams last night. We saw 7 runs from San Francisco, 11 runs from Pittsburgh, had 12 runs coming in from the Los Angeles Angels, whose bats finally woke up and did something yesterday. Cleveland, Boston, San Diego all put up 5 runs as well. So there were a lot of guys who had some big numbers, some big bats that had some big numbers last night. Pitching wise, there weren't a ton of options. One guy who was 80% owned and a lot of 50-50s, maybe even more than that in some. The guy who I saw on almost everybody's cash game roster was Corey Kluber. And he actually didn't have a great start at the beginning. And then he wound up mowing down a whole bunch of guys late. Finished with 7 innings, finished with 13 strikeouts, finished with 35 DraftKings points after you added in the win to him, even though he did give up a couple runs, a couple hits, a couple walks. But it was another dominating performance from Kluber. If you don't use this guy, you got to start using him. Strikeout upside and strikeout floor is something we talk about all the time. And this guy is striking out people at just an amazing rate. I think his last 4 games, he's been 18 strikeouts, 12 strikeouts, 7 strikeouts, and then 13 strikeouts. So you're basically talking about someone who has 50 strikeouts over their last 4 games. He's going 7-8 innings every start right now. I think he's averaging 8 innings a start. So you're getting a guy with high innings, high strikeouts. I mean, that's exactly what you want in daily fantasy. The other guy who was a stud pitcher last night was Eduardo Rodriguez, the rookie from Boston who they just called up. He basically looked like the stud that some people are expecting him to be. There's talk that he's going to stay around and stay in the rotation even before his start yesterday. Boston has basically kind of soured on Joe Kelly from what I'm hearing out of the Boston camps and from their beat writers. So I think there's a chance that we might be seeing Rodriguez and we might be able to use him going forward. If any of you guys are season-long guys, today might be a good day to go out there and throw in a claim for him if you have a chance to. Basically, he was about 5K last night, finished with 32 DraftKings points. Josh actually mentioned early on that he's a left-handed pitcher with an explosive slider. So he was keeping those left-handed bats off balance pretty much all night, getting a lot of ground balls. Guys were swinging over the top of it. He seems to have a lot of late movement on his pitches, so he's definitely somebody who we should keep in mind. If his price stays this low again for his next start, you can bet that we're going to be mentioning him if that's one of the days that we got the show going on. So let's move on and talk about some bats. Like I said, there was a lot of runs scored, a lot of big bats last night. Chris Iannetta had a 3-run home run. Brian McCann had a 3-run home run. So they were basically the guys you wanted to use at catchers. They both had about 20-plus points. Excuse me. There were a lot of guys last night, though. I mean, Pujols had 20, Marte, McCutchen, Billy Burns had about 20, Hanley Ramirez homered. He had about 20. Josh Harrison, Brandon Moss, Kang Hung-jo. Justin Upton had a big game. Basically all these guys scored around 20 points. Guys like Neil Walker, Brett Gardner, they had around 15 points if you were playing over on DraftKings. So there was a ton of ways you could have got to the top last night. With the scoring being so high and the fact that there were bats everywhere, like I mentioned to you guys the other day, I track the moonshot every day. Last night, the winner for the moonshot, it wasn't a stack. It wasn't somebody who stacked the Angels and their 12 runs. It was a guy who had Iannetta and Pujols and, had Kang in there and had, a couple of these guys together that all scored 20 points from different teams. Some of the top in the moonshot looked more along the lines of like a cash game roster. And you're going to get that on a day where there's a short slate because there really aren't that many options. So basically every combination of guys that you can think of is probably covered in if you played in, I think the moonshot last night was 50 or 100,000. So if you're looking at 16 to 30,000 entries, you can bet that with only 6 teams, just about every combination of guys is going to be covered. And again, like we told you on the short slate, you probably had 3,000 or 4,000 people who stacked this team or stacked that team. And that's rarely the way to get to the top because some of those guys have to make some outs at some point. And if you can figure out which guys are going to make outs and take them out of your stack and put other guys in who can outperform them, that's really the way that we've been seeing people get to the top of the moonshot lately. If you're a, tournament player who's playing in those kind of games. So that's our recap from last night. Gives us a couple ideas, a couple things to think about going into tonight's action. There's a few studs like Kluber on the mound that we're going to look at. And there's also a couple cheap options, guys that could fill the role of an Eduardo Rodriguez tonight. So Josh will get into them when we talk about our pitching. But before that, let's just set up everything else going on today. There's really only one game that has potential weather issues, and that is the St. Louis Cardinals at the LA Dodgers. The other game, if you're playing the early lock games, is the 4 o'clock game with the Chicago Cubs. Basically, there's a little bit of rain expected in the Midwest. It looks like the rain may be coming at like a sustained rate if it does get there. But so far, they're saying that it might just miss St. Louis tonight for that St. Louis and LA Dodgers game. So if the rain does stay north of it, which is what they're expecting it to do right now, we may not have any issues at all. If the rain does come, though, if that front moves a little bit to the south, it looks like it's going to be sustained rain for a while. So there's a chance for a big delay, maybe even a cancellation. So make sure you keep an eye on that when it gets closer to lineup lock. Again, if you want to be somebody who takes chances in a small tournament tonight, it might be a good idea to throw some of the bats or some of the pitchers from those games in, thinking that nobody else will have them and they'll be low owned because they get scared off from the rain. But if you're playing in cash games, if you hear anything that game might be canceled, you definitely want to stay away from all the bats on St. Louis and the Dodgers. There aren't a ton on the Dodgers that I think I really love today. Lackey's not a horrible pitcher, but, again, they do have some left-handed bats to attack them. Over on the Dodgers side, though, I definitely think Bolsinger could struggle a little bit with all the left-handed bats on St. Louis. So it is something to think about, something to keep in mind. Moving on to the Vegas lines today. We always start with the games with the least amount of runs. So there's two games that are under 7 runs today. The first is Miami and the New York Mets. That's a 6.5 run line. And that's Matt Harvey day going up against Dan Herron. So obviously Harvey is a big favorite here. They're expecting Harvey to probably only give up 1 or 2 runs. They're probably expecting Herron to give up maybe 3 or 4. And that's how you get to that 6.5 total altogether. So Harvey is definitely somebody in play. Herron is somebody who, again, they're playing this game in Citi Field. Citi Field is a very good pitcher's park. So, it might help limit the damage on either side of that game today. The one that's more interesting to me, though, the other game with the really low total is Pittsburgh and San Diego. And this is a matchup between Francisco Liriano and James Shields. So you got 2 guys on the mound that have been pitching pretty well, 2 guys who are pretty much strikeout pitchers, and the run total here is very low. So while I kind of like this game and I kind of like both of these guys, that also presents the problem to me because the fact that I like both of these guys means neither one of them is really a favorite for the win. Obviously, there's a favorite in the game, but, you can see it either way. You could see Liriano going out and shutting down San Diego. You can see Shields going out and shutting down Pittsburgh. I think that Shields matchup is a little bit better than the one that Liriano has. But, again, it could go either way. And when there's a game that can go either way, like looking at that Harvey game with Herron, you're pretty sure that Harvey should be the guy who comes out on top there. So you're, confident that if you're using Harvey, there's a good chance you're going to get the win and that he can put up the same kind of numbers that a Shields or a Liriano can. With a Shields or a Liriano, though, you don't know which one of them is going to get the win. So there's really no certainty there. So it's not something that you could bank on. So I would need a significant discount off of Harvey if I was going to switch off to Liriano or Shields. And even then, I'm still up in the air about which one I would take in that matchup. So it's a lot tougher, but it is something I wanted to point out to you guys. There's 4 games that have high run totals today, 8.5 or above. The 2 with 9 runs are Toronto and Minnesota. That's a matchup between Mark Burley and Trevor May, 2 guys who have been knocked around a little bit, so we can see why they're expecting a lot of runs in that one. The second one is Boston and Texas. That's Giovanni Gallardo, who's been a little bit home run prone, so we can see why a line on his game would be high. And he's going up against Stephen Wright for Boston, who's really been getting knocked around as well. So the 9 runs there also makes perfect sense. The one 8.5 run game that was a little surprising to me is that Arizona-Milwaukee game. Ruby De La Rosa and Jimmy Nelson are both solid pitchers. They're not great, but they're both guys who are, worthy of giving a look on most nights when they're on the mound. Both of them are pretty high strikeout guys. Nelson has a little bit of a home run problem. He's been giving up a lot of bombs, and that's really what's been hurting him. But he's also been pretty good. He's been striking a lot of guys out. He hasn't been giving up a lot of the negative events. So he's been pretty solid there. So 8.5 runs kind of seems a little high for me on that one. The last thing I wanted to mention is the game between Houston and the Chicago White Sox. Now, this is a matchup between 2 very good young pitching prospects. You got Carlos Rondon on one side and Lance McCullers on the other side. Now, a lot of people have been talking about both of these guys, and Josh and I are going to actually mention both of them today. The problem I have here is if everybody's talking about these guys because their price is so cheap, it is an 8.5 run line here. So Vegas is expecting to see some runs in this game. It's not like they're expecting these 2 guys to go pitch dueling shutouts in a 6 or 7 run total and, nobody to do any scoring. So it's definitely something that you want to keep in mind for the future going forward. The The favorites on the mound, we got Hamels at -170, Harvey at -160. McCullers in that game. I mean, everyone's talking about Rondon, but Lance McCullers is actually the guy who's the favorite in that one at -150 right now. Tim Hudson, who no one's talking about because he doesn't, is favorite today. He's a big favorite at 145. And the last guy is Sonny Gray at -140. So those are the guys on the mound who are, expected to do the best today and your best chance to get you a win. We're going to get into starting pitching right now. I'm just going to mention a couple things that I saw and then kick it over to Josh and, let him get in depth on it. For me, the top guy on the day is going to be Matt Harvey. He's one of the biggest favorites. He did get shelled in his last outing, but, again, it was his first bad start, so I'm willing to excuse that. It's a home game for him. The Marlins have a pretty high strikeout rate. They're about 22.5%. It's not the highest in the league, but it's also not something that's low. And, again, Harvey's a big strikeout pitcher anyway, so I still expect him to wind up with a bunch of strikeouts here. There are a couple negatives as well. I mean, Harvey's expensive all over. I think he's the top price pitcher on Aces. Pretty sure he's top price pitcher on DraftKings and FanDuel as well. So you're definitely not getting a discount on him today. You're going to need him to pitch very well in order to pay off his salary. But again, I mean, this guy's been a stud. He hasn't done anything to make me think he's not going to be able to go out there and pitch a good game today. The one other drawback is the Marlins aren't a bad hitting team against right-handed pitching. They have like a 256 batting average against right-handers right now. So they're about 11th in the league. So it's, right outside of the top third. Again, they're in the top half of the league. So they're better at it than they are bad at it. So there are a couple negatives with Harvey, but again, I think he's probably the biggest stud. I think he's probably the safest guy that can get you, 18 to 20 points on FanDuel. Come up with a 25 to 35 point game on DraftKings and 15 to 20 point game over on Aces. So he's definitely somebody I think you got to look at. The guy who I'm really interested in, though, is Trevor Bauer. Bauer is really cheap relative to the other top studs today. And basically in his last 3 games, this guy's been phenomenal. Over on FanDuel, I think he's put up 18, 18, and 16 in his last 3. Over on DraftKings, he's got 3 scores in the mid to high 20s in his last 3 games. And at his price today of only I think he's 8,600 on he's 8,600 on FanDuel. I think he's 8,400 on DraftKings. And then over on Aces, he's actually really cheap for me. He's like 6,350 over there. So I definitely think he's somebody else you can look at. He is a favorite today. Not a big favorite, though. I think he's about a -110 at the moment in a game that's being played in Seattle. So it's a good pitcher's park. And I think the run line on that game is only about 7.5. So it's not like Vegas is expecting him to get lit up today. So I definitely think Bauer's a guy that you can look at. He goes up against a team that has a 24.1% strikeout rate in Seattle. So Bauer being a high strikeout guy against a high strikeout team, I think that presents a really nice floor for you. And, like I said, low run total, decent amount of innings expected on this guy. So there's a lot of upside to using him today. The third guy who I've been rolling out there is Lance McCullers, who we talked about. Basically, this guy's cheap all over. You can get him at 5,100 on DraftKings. You get him at 5,400 on FanDuel, and he's basically min price at 5K over on Aces. He's a -150 favorite here. Again, the run total is a little bit high in this game, but he's the favorite. So at most, they're expecting maybe 3 or 4 runs out of him. The problem I have with him is he's not very efficient. He only goes about 6 innings in his starts. Again, this is only his 3rd start too. But he does have about a strikeout per inning. So if he can get you 6 innings and get you those 5 or 6 strikeouts, he's going to have a really nice floor under his game, especially at the price that he's being asked for. That would be 12 or 13 FanDuel points right there at a price of, 5,400, which would be more than 2 points per 1,000, which is what we look for. And this doesn't even include things like the win. It also doesn't include the negatives of runs that he gives up. But he hasn't been giving up a lot of runs. His ERA is only 2.32, so he's been pretty good. So he's a guy that I think you could also look at. Again, if you use a guy like McCullers, I'd probably use him more as a starting pitcher too, as a tournament option on on an Aces or probably mostly on a DraftKings where I think his price is the friendliest. I don't know if I'd roll him out there on FanDuel on a single pitcher site. Definitely not for cash games. But again, this guy is the cheapest pitcher on the board. So if you do roll him out there, you're going to be able to spend up and get whatever bats that you want in your lineup. But that's basically my rundown. I mean, there's a couple guys I'm going to be staying away from. Like I said, I like McCullers, so I'm probably going to be staying away from Rondon. I know a lot of people have been talking about him, so that might be a mistake. I'm hoping Josh can shed some more light on that for me. And the other two guys I'm staying away from, as I mentioned, are Liriano and Shields. Not that I dislike either one of them. I just don't know which one I like more, and therefore neither one of them becomes a play to me. I'm not going to be targeting bats against those guys, but I'm probably also not going to be targeting them. But again, I get a lot of my pitching stuff. I do my own research, and then I listen to one guy, and that guy's been keeping me on the right path today. So, Josh, you ready to set me straight and tell me who I should be looking at for pitching?
Yeah, there's a lot of guys today I want to talk about, and I'll just give a little bit of a blurb on each one. But the first guy I want to mention is not usually I mention my top plays right away, but I want to talk about Matt Harvey today because Harvey has what is called dead arm, apparently, is what Terry Collins has been saying in his last start, that he might the reason why he didn't start yesterday, he has 5 days rest. But what dead arm is, for everybody that doesn't know, it's not necessarily a physical issue. I know the real term for dead arm is if somebody has inflammation in the back of their shoulder that could lead to labrum problems. But when you're talking about dead arm for a pitcher, it basically means that their arm just feels heavy. For those of you that have pitched or played baseball before, this is the feeling you get at the day after you pitch or 2 days after you pitch, or if you play in like a softball tournament all day long and your arm's hurting. That's kind of what dead arm feels like. And although he doesn't have his entire repertoire to use, it's something to look at because Harvey is, like Benny said, the top pitcher on the day in terms of matchup, but I can't use him in my 50-50s or head-to-head because of that dead arm. One of the things that you look at with this dead arm thing, especially with a guy that's coming off Tommy John, if he starts to get a little sore or his arm is hurting or bothering him a little bit, the Mets are going to take him out right away. And that's something to look at because in your head-to-heads and 50-50s, you're going to need a guy that's going deep into the game, getting strikeouts and chance for the win. So I can't use Harvey today in my safety games in these 50-50s and head-to-heads simply because he could be taken out at any time. Also, dead arm doesn't necessarily take away a lot of velocity, but what you see is you see a lack of movement from pitchers. You see guys that are throwing a slider and a cutter. I know Adam Wainwright had a game either last year or 2 years ago where he pitched with dead arm, but he had no movement on his pitches. And if you guys are watching Major League Baseball and professional hitters, they can hit anything if it's straight. And that's a lot of the time that's what happens with these pitchers that have dead arm. And that's something scary for Harvey because although he is one of the better pitchers in baseball, if he doesn't have movement on his pitchers, it doesn't matter who he is. That being said, he has an excellent matchup against the Marlins, who don't hit righties well as a whole, simply because the reason why their offense is in the middle or the top is because of D. Gordon's batting average against righties. But the rest of that lineup can't hit righties well. So if you're going to throw him into any of your lineups, be sure that it's tournament only because Harvey could get pulled at any time. That being said, some guys can pitch through dead arm, and if anybody has the arm talent to do it, it's Matt Harvey. So I'm going to have him in probably one tournament lineup. But moving on to my top pitchers for the day, Trevor Bauer is my number one pitcher in my 50-50s and my head-to-heads, and even in tournaments with his ability to strike out a lot of batters. He faces the Mariners, who are hitting just .230 against righties. Their strikeout rate's over 22%. And their slugging percentage is low, which is interesting because they signed Nelson Cruz. They have guys that are hitting a lot of home runs when they do get hits. But one of the reasons why that slugging percentage is low is because of Robinson Cano. And if you guys watched Baseball Tonight last night or MLB Network last night, Harold Reynolds detailed why he's in a slump. So if you get a chance to see that, be sure to check that out somewhere on the internet. You can Google it. But it's an interesting piece. But it's just one of the many reasons why the Mariners are struggling against righties. And that's why I like Trevor Bauer today. His only issue in his career has been his inability to throw strikes. And 2 of his last 4 starts, he has 0 walks. So he seems to be turning a corner, and that's really paying dividends as he goes later into games. He has one of the better sliders for a right-handed pitcher in baseball, and that's the reason why he's getting a lot of strikeouts and the main reason why I'm targeting him against that Mariners lineup that has a lot of righties but has lefties as well. But all those lefties have a wheelhouse swing, meaning they're going to swing over top of that slider, translating to a lot of strikeouts for Trevor Bauer. My second pitcher today is Cole Hamels against the Rockies. Now, it's odd to say that a pitcher in 50-50s and head-to-heads facing the Rockies is a good idea, but with Hamels today, it's just that. The Rockies are actually struggling against left-handed pitchers this year because although their batting average is high, their slugging percentage is low, which is unusual for a Colorado offense, and they're striking out the most in baseball against left-handed pitchers. And for those of you that have watched Cole Hamels in his career, you know he's just that. He can strike out a lot of guys. He has probably, if not the best changeup from the left side, one of the best changeups, probably Chris Sale's changeup's a little bit better. And you see guys like that come out of the bullpen that have good changeups as well. But Cole Hamels can throw his changeup at any count, at any time during the game, and even if a guy sees it once or twice, it leaves the strike zone in a hurry. And that's one of the reasons why he's been so successful this year. He's been one of the most dominant pitchers, especially with his strikeout rate being close to 24%. And with a matchup against the Rockies, who will still try to roll out all those righties, he can use that changeup to his advantage and get a lot of strikeouts and hopefully get a win today, which he's getting run support, which is something that we weren't used to seeing in Philadelphia. So my top two guys in 50-50s and head-to-heads today, I'm playing for Bauer and Cole Hamels. The third guy I want to discuss is Ruby De La Rosa from the pitching against the Brewers today, pitching for the Diamondbacks. He has the top overall matchup today because the Brewers, as we always talk about, have given up a ton of fantasy points to opposing pitchers this year. You see some of the top guys, their performances become against Milwaukee. Now, Milwaukee's offense has been better of late. You see those guys like Carlos Gomez, Ryan Braun starting to hit the ball well. Aramis Ramirez has a few home runs. But they're all right-handed heavy, and Ruby De La Rosa can do that. He gets righties out at a high rate. He also has a very high strikeout rate, which is unusual because in his past he hasn't had a strikeout rate of over 20 to 22%. But it's at 23% today, which is the same rate that the Brewers are striking out. So simple math tells you if he faces 30 hitters, he's going to get at least 6 or 7 strikeouts, which is more than a good enough number for his price. He's probably going to be my top tournament pitcher on one-pitcher sites like FanDuel because he offers a little bit of a discount than guys like Hamels or guys like Harvey, but he can still strike out a lot of hitters, and you can afford more bats if you use them. Now, there are some other pitchers that I want to talk about, but it's interesting because not a lot of these guys showed up on my original research, but they're still good pitchers. And that first guy is James Shields against the Pirates. The Pirates crushed the ball yesterday. They scored 12 runs. A lot of people use the Pirates stack to win a lot of money, but they faced Ian Kennedy. Shields is a bit different than Ian Kennedy. Ian Kennedy gave up a lot of hits, a lot of home runs. He throws a straight fastball last night. Not the opposite of what Shields does. Shields has movement everywhere. He's throwing that knuckle curve, which I've talked about before on the show. And he's using his repertoire of pitchers to strike out over 31% of batters this year, which if it's not the highest in baseball among starters, it's one of them. And that's one reason to target these Pirates bat because they do strike out a lot from the left side or from the right side. He didn't meet the original thresholds because the Pirates are actually performing better against righties than lefties. But considering the fact that Shields is a great pitcher, I would not be afraid to use him today. One other guy I want to mention is Mike Bolsinger against the Cardinals. Now, the Cardinals are a great offensive team. It's hard to pitch against them. But you saw Corey Kluber strike out 18 hitters, so they're not unbeatable. It's hard to ignore what Bolsinger has done in his 4 starts this year. It's a 0.71 ERA and a 0.79 WHIP. He's coming off an 8-inning, 1-hit performance against the Padres as well, and it's really something to take note of because in his 4 starts, he's faced 3 good offenses, including the Giants and the Rockies, who can all hit right-handed pitching pretty well. Now, the one thing about Bolsinger, and I think that's why he's been so successful this year, he only has 2 pitches, and he throws both of them at 50% of the time, a fastball and a curveball. Doesn't throw hard, but he's able to throw both of these pitches to either side of the plate. Now, the reason why I can't use him in 50-50s and head-to-heads is because he only has 2 pitches. I talked about that before. If a guy only has 2 pitches, that third time through the order, major league hitters are going to find that and they're going to hit the ball hard. And you see that a lot. His last start was the only time he went the third time through the order. And although he did pitch well, he just got to the middle of that order before they took him out. He didn't face, I think he faced 1 more than the minimum batters. But before that, he had only thrown 6 innings, 5 2/3, 5 2/3. So be careful to watch out for him when he gets to the third time through the order. And that's the one reason I can only use him in tournaments. I talked about Harvey earlier, and I can only use him in tournaments as well. But his opponent today is Dan Herron. The Mets are terrible against righties this year. They only have a few hitters that can hit against right-handed pitching, Lucas Duda being one of them. But Herron today came up on almost all the check boxes. The only one he didn't come up on was strikeouts. He's only striking out 17% of batters this year. He's not a huge strikeout guy. My reason for not being able to use him today is simply because of that strikeout ability. I don't like to target guys that could only get 2 or 3 strikeouts because I think you're limiting your upside. And I can't use a guy like Dan Herron in my 50-50s and head-to-heads because he doesn't have that floor to get a few strikeouts if he gives up a few runs. So you're relying on a guy to pitch a shutout or 1 or 2 earned runs, and I just can't do that with a guy like Herron. The last guy Benny talked about was Lance McCullers, and I wanted to touch on him as well. He's incredibly cheap, which is really insane because he has a ton of talent. So far this year, he's a very high ground ball rate, has a high strikeout rate. He has great stuff. A lot of Astros fans are really excited to see him close to the top of the rotation in the next few years. The White Sox are his opponent today, and they're decent against righties, but they're not great. They're just about in the middle of the pack. So with a guy with very talented stuff like McCullers, he could be a good option in tournaments, especially at a cheap price. But Benny alluded to the lack of efficiency he has when it does pitch, and that's a real concern because you're seeing him in the 90s in pitch count by the fifth inning. He rarely gets through the sixth, and that's because he throws a lot of three-ball counts. And it's usually a common thing with pitchers with good stuff. So be sure to keep an eye on that. He does have strikeout upside, but he can't go deep into games. So I'm only using him in my tournaments today if I need a cheap pitcher because you can afford those big bats. The only two guys I'm staying away from today are Steven Strasburg, and if you haven't watched him yet, he's one of the most talented pitchers in baseball, but he has a 6.5 ERA. He's been getting lit up every start. Until he proves otherwise, I'm staying away from him. And the other guy is Anibal Sanchez. He comes up in pretty much everyone's research today because the Angels struggle against righties. But Anibal Sanchez has struggled against everybody this year. He has an ERA of over 6. He has a high strikeout rate, but it doesn't matter if a guy's giving up a whole bunch of runs. He's very inconsistent. And the fact that his price is actually higher or just below Trevor Bauer really takes me off of him. So be sure to stay away from those two guys. Take a look at Bauer and Cole Hamels in your 50-50s and head-to-heads and sprinkle in some McCullers and even some Harvey in your tournaments. Benny, you have anything else to add?
I thought that was pretty good. The stuff that you said about Harvey kind of has me double thinking using him right now. Would you say, like, if other people had done what I did and had made some early rosters where they had Harvey in there, obviously, I mean, I use Bauer a lot too. So would Hamels probably be the guy to come off to? Would you think that would make the most sense?
Yeah, I like that too, and it's a shame because Harvey's such a great pitcher and we would love to use him, but I'm just not sure if I can target a guy that may not have movement on his pitches. As we all know, those major league hitters crush anything straight. So I would probably come off of Harvey for Hamels. Harvey's still a good option in tournaments, but I can't trust him with that arm issue, even though he has that one extra day of rest.
Well, I mean, you know, the arm issue, now that you mention that, it kind of makes it a clearer picture for people because I know somebody had mentioned in chat that last game he went out and I think it was 1.8 points or something like that he had last game against Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Yeah, he threw like a horrible game. And, you know, now that you have a reason, like I said, when I first talked about him earlier, I said, well, I'm willing to excuse it. It was that one bad start. But once you hear the reason why behind it, now it's, you know, like I said, now it's something that I'm definitely going to be considering and thinking about. So there's a good chance I'm going to be coming off him as well. So perfect. All right. That pretty much sums up our starting pitching for today. You know, Josh brought some great information here for you guys. So make sure you take advantage of it. You know, Bauer, Hamels, you know, a guy like McCullers, some of the other guys he mentioned are, you know, definitely going to be guys that I have to go back and take a look at when the show's over here. So we're going to be moving on. As always, the second part of our show, I'm going to give you guys some of the bats that have popped up in some of our research today. And then Josh and I are going to go in and give you some cornerstones that you guys can use to help build your rosters around and hopefully win some money. Starting off at catcher today, which is not something that I really want to do because I do not love the catcher position today. But there are two guys that I wanted to mention. The first guy is Buster Posey. And Posey doesn't have the splits matchup that he prefers, but he hits well against people from either side of the plate. Gets a matchup today with Mike Folty-Newitz from Atlanta. Folty-Newitz has not really been a very good pitcher so far. He's usually given up more to left-handed batters, but again, it's not like right-handed batters are struggling against them. They're still doing pretty well. They're still doing pretty good as well too. So Posey is probably one of the guys who I like the most. Now again, he's expensive. I think he's 5,700 on Aces, 47 on DraftKings. He's above 4,000 on FanDuel today as well. But that San Francisco offense is really starting to click now. Posey was kind of left out there in the cold for a while, but now he's got his 4-hitter Hunter Pence and his 5-hitter Brandon Belt back in the mix. So with those guys in the middle of that order, you know, that order somebody else gets pushed down a spot or two. You take out one or two of the weak bats that they had in there because they didn't have, you know, they were basically playing with some of their second team guys. So that order has basically been putting up, you know, massive amounts of runs. I think they had 7 more last night. You know, they had a couple 10-run games against Colorado last week. They put up a couple runs when they played in their last few series. So definitely think that Posey is somebody who's in play. His numbers haven't been great lately, but again, I think that's a pretty good matchup against a bad pitcher today, and I expect that San Francisco offense to score some runs. So as long as he's still batting in the 3-hole, you know, he's going to have something to say about it and, you know, either be one of the guys driving in those runs or one of the guys getting driven in by the bats behind him. The second guy who has a decent matchup today, to me, is Derek Norris. Now, Norris has been hot lately. Basically, he's got a tougher matchup today against Francisco Liriano, but it is the lefty-righty split that he wants. Norris last year hit 311 against left-handed pitching, and so far this year he's hitting 438 against left-handers. So he is an elite right-handed bat against left-handed pitching. Now, he is going up against a pitcher who is right on the borderline of that elite level with Francisco Liriano. I wouldn't say he's one of the best in the game, but he's definitely better than, most of the rest of the ones that aren't up in that pot as well. And, Norris has actually gotten a couple hits in his last couple games, batting 5th in that order for San Diego right now. So he's in a good RBI spot, and he's really, really cheap. On FanDuel, he's $2,700. Over on DraftKings, I think he's like 32 or 33. So if you can get a guy at a catcher position that's pretty thin, who is hitting in the meat of his order, has the right splits matchup that he likes, and has been knocking a couple hits in. I think he has hits in 4 of his last 5 games or something along those lines. 1 or 2 of those games were multiple hits, has an RBI or 2 here or there, scored a run here or there. If you can get a guy like that at a cheap price who's pretty safe, I think he's a great cash game play for you. And I also think that he has the kind of upside that he might even be able to help you out in a GPP. Like I said, $2,700 on FanDuel is really cheap for a catcher, and $3,300 on DraftKings is pretty much dirt cheap too. If you look at the other guys that are around him down there, he's probably the best player of the options that you can find at those prices. And again, he doesn't have the greatest matchup. I wish it was more of a gas can lefty than Francisco Liriano, but again, it's the splits that he likes, and he's going to be in a good situation that way. So hopefully he'll be able to, even if he only gets 1 or 2 hits and an RBI or 2, he's going to more than pay off his salary for you. So I think that if you're looking to pay up today, if you have the money, you gotta look at Posey, because a lot of the guys in the middle, there's nothing there that makes me think they're going to be in good spots. And if you don't have the money to pay up for Posey, I'm putting in Derek Norris and moving on and not worrying too much about it. First base is actually a position today where I do think you need to spend up. And before I start, I just want to give props to Josh yesterday. For those of you who check back on the RotoCurve site during the day, Josh does a piece called Curve Your Enthusiasm, where he takes a guy who everyone's talking about that he thinks is going to underperform. And the guy that he picked out yesterday was Prince Fielder. And I got to be honest, I think I might have had Fielder in 1 or 2 of my games. He wasn't in my cash game lineup, but I definitely had him in a GPP lineup or 2, because the guy's been on fire. I mean, he basically, before last night, he was 15 for his last 32 with 5 home runs, 9 RBIs, and 5 multi-hit games in his last 6. Those are some pretty elite numbers that he has been putting up lately. Basically, he's been the hottest hitter in baseball. So that's why it was a great call yesterday by Josh to fade him. And the reason why is because he was going up against a left-handed pitcher. Now, today, he doesn't have that problem. He goes up against a right-handed pitcher and a pretty gas can right-handed pitcher as well. The guy going for Boston today, his name is Stephen Wright. He has, 33 innings worth of major league work against left-handed batters. He's given up 34 hits, 17 runs, and 3 home runs to left-handed hitters so far. So a guy like Prince Fielder, who basically feasts on weak right-handed pitching, is getting his preferred matchup today, and he's getting his preferred matchup against a guy who really struggles with left-handed bats. So when you take his propensity to hit right-handers along with Wright's struggles against left-handed batters, you really can't get into a much better situation. The game that they're playing today is in Texas. Texas is a pretty good hitter's park, so there's definitely a lot of upside to using Prince Fielder today. Plus, the kicker for me is, everybody who used him yesterday in his 0 for 4, 0 for 5 performance is going to be part of the I ain't using him crowd. He's overrated. He's not as good as them. So let everybody else walk away from Prince, and better that yesterday's 0 for 4 was more a product of the matchup that he had than it was of anything that Prince does. And, again, I think he's going to be, I think he's going to be right back onto that 15, 20 point a game average that he had been pounding out over the last week. And, let everybody else walk away from him. Today's the day to hop back on that bandwagon. If you decide, there are 2 other first basemen that I'm looking at. One guy is somebody who had 2 home runs again the other day, and that's Lucas Duda. He goes up against Dan Harron, who Josh mentioned hasn't been bad so far this year. His numbers this year have been well above his numbers the last 2 years, though, which has me thinking that he probably has some regression coming in his future. In 2013, he gave up 28 home runs. In 2014, he gave up 27 home runs. This year, he's already given up 8 home runs. 8 is, a pretty, basically keeps him on pace for another 24 as we're about 2 months into the season. He allows them equally to guys from both sides of the plate, although right-handed hitters have actually been doing a little bit better against him than left-handers. But left-handed hitters have been hitting him for a little more power. So if I'm going to use a guy like Lucas Duda today, the power is really what you're looking for, the power upside with him. I'm not going to be expecting 2 home runs. I probably wouldn't even be expecting a home run. But if Duda's price on some of these sites hasn't come up all that much, I mean, this guy has been, as consistent as can be, especially against right-handed pitching. So against right-handed pitching, Lucas Duda, to me, is going to be another guy that's in play. The last guy I want to mention at first base is Brandon Belt. Belt is a little more expensive, but he has a really good matchup today against Mike Folty-Newitz. Folty-Newitz in 21 innings pitched, left-handed batters are hitting .333 against him with 5 home runs. So he's basically giving up a home run to lefties 1 every 4 innings. And again, one out of every 3 at-bats, the lefties are getting a hit against him. So I definitely think that Belt, who's been hot lately, hitting in that Giants lineup that's been scoring runs and hitting behind guys like Posey and Pence, is going to get a chance to drive some runs in today and, probably pick up at least 1 hit, if not more than 1 hit. So if I wasn't using Prince Fielder, who I think is the stud on the day at first base, Lucas Duda and Brandon Belt definitely have some upside for me and would be interesting guys for me to include in a tournament, or if you're playing in the qualifier over on Fantasy Aces tonight. I definitely think tonight is one of those nights where you put more than 1 first baseman into that qualifier lineup and, hope that the power and the money you spend at first base can help power your lineup. Moving on to second base, I mean, the stud of the day is Jason Kipnis. He's in the best spot. The guy, I was looking at his numbers over on Aces because I was trying to decide whether 5,800 on Aces was too much to spend up for this guy. But he's basically scored 51 fantasy points over on Aces. So he's a guy who's averaging over 5.1 Aces points every time that he steps out there to play. And today he has a great matchup. Goes up against the young Taijuan Walker of Seattle. Walker has really struggled with left-handed bats. Walker has been giving up a ton of runs. He had 1 good start his last time out, but a couple of the starts before that were, negative numbers on DraftKings, low single-digit numbers. So Walker hasn't really been great. He hasn't been what everybody expected him to take that next step forward. Kipnis right now, on the other hand, though, has been absolutely on fire. He basically always hits well against right-handed pitching. It's something he's done for a long time. And with the way that Walker's been struggling against left-handers, I think Kipnis is not only safe for you to use in cash games tonight, but I also think that, with the home run power that he has and with all the multi-hit gains he's been having lately, that he has the kind of upside that you need, that he could even help you out in the tournament. So, again, he's expensive. He's 5,800 over on Aces. I think he's 49 on DraftKings. I don't remember what he was on FanDuel because I didn't use him over there. But I'm assuming he's above 4,000 over there as well. So he does have an elite matchup today, but again, he's kind of expensive. If you're looking for some guys that you can save on, the one who keeps popping up on all my research right now is Ben Zobrist. No, Zobrist just came back from injury, and basically against left-handed pitching, they slotted him right back into the 3 hole that he was batting in before he got hurt earlier in the year. He's a switch hitter, so he actually does prefer hitting from the right side against left-handed pitching. He had 340 against left-handers and 140 at-bats last year in 2014. And so far this year, he's actually even upped that average. He's hitting 350 against them, obviously in limited at-bats since he was out for a little while. He faces Chris Capuano of the Yankees. He has a long history of struggling against right-handed batters. So I definitely think this is a great matchup for Zobrist today. The splits are heavily in his favor. The ballpark is a little bit of a drawback. They're playing in Oakland, but again, that's his home ballpark right now. So at this point, he's been playing in it all season, and he's still been able to keep that average up. And the thing that I really like about him is he's pretty cheap today. He's only $3,000 on FanDuel. I think he's actually below $4,000 over on DraftKings, and he's second base eligible. Now, if you're not going to pay up for a guy like Kipnis, I think you can get solid cash game production out of a guy like Zobrist. I don't think he has the same kind of upside that a Kipnis does. But again, Kipnis is $1,000, $1,200, $1,500 more expensive depending on what site you're playing on. So, price is basically what we follow when we're making our teams. And, again, as much as I like Kipnis and Kipnis's upside, if you're playing in cash games today, I think Zobrist can give you a nice return without costing you the same kind of money that it would cost to get a guy like Kipnis into your lineup. The only other guy that I wanted to mention real quick is Jace Peterson, and I would really probably on aces. He's right around $4,000 on aces. Left-handed bat on top of that lineup, going up against Tim Hudson. Again, he hasn't been great. He doesn't have a ton of upside, but I do like the matchup for him. Left-hander going up against Hudson. If he puts the ball on the ground, he's got some speed, so he could leg out an infield single here or there. Maybe steal a base, score a run. As we always talk about on DraftKings, if you can do that, that's 10 points. If you can do it at $3,000, that makes you a cash game value play on one at bat. So he is somebody that is riskier. I would much rather get in a Zobrist, or obviously if I can fit him, a Kipnis. But if you really need to save at the position, I don't hate Jace Peterson today either. Moving on to third base. Third base, there are a couple guys I like. The guy who I think is my favorite option at third base today, though, is going to be Trevor Plouffe. Plouffe has been red hot lately. He's got 12 hits in his last 21 at-bats. He has his preferred splits matchup against a left-handed pitcher in Mark Burley. And as we know from past shows, Burley's a guy who struggles against right-handed bats. If this game was up in the Rogers Center in Toronto, I'd probably feel even stronger about using Plouffe today. But I'm still okay using him either way. His price is pretty decent over on FanDuel. He's below $3,000. I think he's a $2,900 player, which is pretty cheap for a cleanup hitter and a good matchup with the right splits today. So I definitely think he's someone in play over there. DraftKings, I think he's still below 4,000 too. I think he's like 39 or 3,800. So if that's the case, I don't remember off the top of my head, but if that's the case, I think he's really solidly priced over there. Again, you're not going to find a lot of cleanup hitters below 4,000 that are in a game where there's a chance that they could explode for a big run total. And I definitely think that Minnesota is in that kind of a matchup today against Burley. The other guy, this one's a little bit more of a riskier play. Probably something, Plouffe makes sense to me in cash games. He even has GPP upside as well. He's somebody you can use in the tournament because he does have that home run potential, especially in that righty-lefty split against Burley. But a guy who I think is sneaky for tournaments, who I'm going to be rolling out there, is Todd Frazier. Now, Frazier's matched up against Strasburg today. Again, I can't explain it, and I don't know why, but you guys who follow me on Twitter saw that I went on a Twitter rant last time, basically telling anybody, if you're still playing Steven Strasburg at this point in time, you have no reason to complain, and you have no leg to stand on, because there's nothing that this guy has done so far in his last couple starts that makes you think that he's worthy of anything above a salary of maybe $7,500 on DraftKings or $7,000 or $8,000 on FanDuel. If you're paying $10,000 for this guy on any site, again, it's just crazy to me at this point. I loved Strasburg when he first came up. I thought this guy was going to be like the next big thing, the next superstar, but he's not right now. I don't know what's wrong with him. Josh is more of a pitching guru than me. You can hit him up on Twitter later. Maybe he has some thoughts on it. But what I do know is that this guy is not pitching like the Steven Strasburg that people think he is in their mind. So there's still going to be a lot of people rostering Strasburg today. And basically somebody mentioned last time that you have made, I think, 10 times more money so far this season by rostering bats against Strasburg than you have by actually taking them. And part of the reason for that is, the stuff that he usually does, that he usually has been able to hang his hat on, is not stuff that is working for him this year. He's normally really tough on right-handed batters. Well, so far this year, right-handed batters have been teeing off on him. I think he's already given up about 6 or 7 home runs to right-handed batters. So if you're looking for a guy that could have some sneaky home run upside for you in a tournament today, who should probably go off low owned because people are going to be on Strasburg or scared away from him because they see Strasburg's name, I think Todd Frazier is that guy for us. Again, Frazier's been hitting a couple home runs. He's still hitting up high in that order. I think he's been batting either second or third, depending on, the handedness, and they've been jostling around guys like Phillips and Cozart in that one hole. So that lineup is a little bit in flux, but that Frazier's going to be somewhere in the top 3 or 4 there. And again, he does have some home run upside. So while Plouffe is my favorite option at third base, if I can't get Plouffe and I have to spend up for Frazier, for tournaments, I don't think that's a bad idea, but I wouldn't do it in cash games. Moving on to shortstop, there's 2 guys at shortstop that I really like. And one of them is I don't know, I'm not even going to call him the safer play, but he's basically the chalk play that you're going to hear everybody mention today, and that's Marcus Semien. Semien is one of the few Oakland bats who profiles to do well against a weak left-handed pitcher. When Oakland sees a left-hander, he usually bats up in the 2 hole in their lineup. He had 271 against Southpaws last year, which is good but not great. This year, he's actually been very good. He's been 304 against left-handed pitching so far in 2015. We already mentioned Chris Capuano. He struggles against right-handed batters. We discussed it with Zobrist. And I think that these two guys are both somewhat cheap everywhere, where if you pair the two of them together, they're going to be hitting probably in a 2 and a 3 hole up there for Oakland. And, you might get a pretty nice return out of those two guys for a pretty cheap amount of money at two tough-to-fill middle infield positions. Now, if you want somebody who I think is cash game safe and has even more upside, though, Jung-Ho Kang from Pittsburgh is one of those guys who I think people need to start taking notice of. He's been batting 5th in that order, so he's hitting right behind all those big bats that we always talk about on Pittsburgh, right behind the Neil Walker, Andrew McCutcheon, Sterling Marte trio that usually hits 2nd, 3rd, and 4th for them. And Kang basically, here's some stats on Kang that you guys probably don't know about. So far, he only has 104 at-bats in the major leagues because he came over from Korea. But he's hitting over 300. He's already has 3 home runs. I think he has 7 doubles. So basically in 104 at-bats, this guy already has 10 extra base hits. So that's pretty good, a 10% extra base hit rate from a middle infielder. The second thing is, in his last 10 games, he's been averaging over 10.2 DraftKings points per game over his last 10. So he scored 102 DraftKings points in his last 10 games. That's great production from any point. If you got that from an outfielder, you'd be pretty happy. If you get it from a $3,300 shortstop, though, I mean, that's just phenomenal. And that's part of the reason why I love him so much, because he plays a position that's tough to fill, and his price is very, very cheap. I mean, $3,300 is basically a steal. Now, you're probably saying, well, what's the upside on this guy? Well, here's the upside on him. Last year in a Korean league, which I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, is definitely a step below the major leagues. But from what people are telling me about, the level of play over in Asia, it's pretty much like a AAA or a quadruple A. It's better than it is in the minor leagues over here. And I mean, this guy was tearing the cover off the ball. He had a 350 batting average last season with 40 home runs. So basically, this guy is the Troy Tulowitzki of Southeast Asia. So if you can get Troy Tulowitzki at 3,300 today, and he was hitting well, and he was, basically hitting like he normally hits, everybody on the site would sign up right now to take this guy. Well, if I'm going to give you the Asian version of Troy Tulowitzki for 3,300, there's no reason why you should be shying away from this guy. He's been hitting well. He's starting to get the at-bats. He's in a good lineup spot. He hit a home run yesterday. I mean, there's not a lot of downside to using this guy. It's not the greatest splits matchup, but again, he's so cheap, there's no reason to go away from him. So for me, if I don't use Semien, which I don't think I'm going to because I think he's going to be a little bit highly owned, I think I'm going to be able to get more upside and more safety out of Jung-Ho Kang today. And I promise you guys by the end of this show at least once. Moving on to the outfield for now. I mean, honestly, when you're looking at the outfield today, the first guy that pops up on every chart and is literally popping off the page is Bryce Harper. He's the most expensive hitter on the board. I think he's the most expensive hitter on every site. Definitely the most expensive over on Aces. Definitely the most expensive on FanDuel. I think he's like 6,000 on FanDuel. So he's like the most expensive by a good margin over there. But he goes up against Anthony DeSclafani from Cincinnati. Plays him in a good hitter's park. He's got basically a park bump switching from Washington over to Cincy. Harper has been on fire. He's got 12 hits in his last 30 at-bats. You guys know about, even before that, going back going back like 10 or 15, 20 games, he's probably got about 11 or 12 home runs over the course of that. He's homered in back-to-back games here already. And DeSclafani has really, really struggled with left-handed batters. He's also really struggled with the home run ball. So if you're telling me that I could have one of probably arguably right now the best left-handed power hitter in a game going up against a guy who struggles, the profile of a guy who does well against him is a left-handed hitter with power, well, I mean, this is basically a tailor-made matchup for you. Again, got a good park bump because they're playing in Cincinnati as well. So you got the best hitter in baseball going up against one of the worst guys against left-handed power hitters, and you're putting them in a really good ballpark to hit home runs in. You put all that together, and Harper's definitely worth the money. Now, he's not easy to fit in. He's like $6,000, like I said, basically across the board on every site. And, but again, at the same point in time, if he homers again, he pays that off easily for you in a cash game. And if he homers and does anything else like that, he's giving you the upside that you need for a tournament to, basically be able to take it down if you can surround him with other cheap bats. Another guy in a cheap bat that I've been using in order to fit in Bryce Harper is Michael Kadire. Basically, I agree with what Josh said. Dan Herron has been pretty solid. But again, as we mentioned earlier, Herron has a home run problem. And one of the things that I noticed is over the course of the last 3 years, he also has kind of a reverse split going on. So right-handed batters have been hitting him better than left-handed batters. So a guy like Kadire is somebody who, you might want to use. He has 8 hits in his last 14 at-bats. And again, with, Herron struggling with the home run ball and struggling the right-handed batters, I think Kadire will have a good game against them. The kicker for me with Kadire, too, is he's pretty cheap. It's like $3,800, I think, on DraftKings, $2,700 on FanDuel. So you can use him and, still fit in some of those big bats that you really want, like a guy like a Harper or a Fielder today. As for cheap options, Billy Burns is still a guy who's been pretty cheap. Price is starting to come up a little bit on DraftKings. Over on Aces, though, he's still only $4,000. As long as Coco Crisp is out, he's probably going to be the guy on top of that Oakland order. So I definitely think that Burns is somebody you can look at, too. Gives you another cost saver if you're trying to fit in a guy like Harper. The last guy that I really want to mention is Torrey Hunter. We've mentioned in the past that Minnesota smashes left-handed pitching. So the fact that they're getting a left-hander in Burley today doesn't really go all that well for Burley. You got Dozier on top of that lineup. You got Hunter in second. You got Joe Mauer, who actually hits lefties well despite being a lefty. And then Trevor Plouffe. I think those top 4 guys in the Minnesota order are all in play. Some of you guys always ask who we like for stacks. I think that might be a stack that you might want to put together if you're playing tournaments. But if you're playing in cash games, Hunter is a guy who I think is basically somebody who's cash game safe at this point. He's 3,400 over on FanDuel. I think he's a little over 4,000 on DraftKings. But over on FanDuel, he's got 24 fantasy points in his last 7 games. So he's been averaging a little over 3 points a game, about 3.5 points a game. So that basically pays off his salary, which is, great value for him. There's some other outfield options I wanted to mention. A guy like Ben Revere is getting a little expensive all over, but he's probably the best hitter and in the best matchup on that Philly team. You can use a guy like Denard Span for similar reasons that I said, Bryce Harper's a good play, minus the home run potential. Brandon Moss and Michael Brantley are both in good spots, basically along the same lines as Kipnis. Sin-Shu Chu, basically the same reasoning as Fielder. Mike Trout's in a good spot. And then I also like a lot of those San Francisco bats, guys like Aoki, Pence, Pagan. The way that offense has been playing, all those guys should be able to do some damage today. So that pretty much wraps up our hitter report for the day. Josh and I are going to get into our cornerstones and kind of give you guys an idea on how we're going to be building our rosters. So Josh, how are you building yours and who are you building around?
I'm going to have Bauer and Cole Hamels in my 50-50s and head-to-heads pretty much everywhere. For one-pitcher sites like on FanDuel, I'll probably end up going with Hamels simply because he has the upside to strike a lot of guys out. They're favored to win that game, actually, and he's actually been getting some run support. So the fact that he can get 20 on FanDuel, I'm a lot more safer and confident with that rather than a guy like Trevor Bauer, who sometimes just limits his strikeouts, like his last start. And every now and then he can get into some pitch count selection troubles as well. But I like both of them a lot. They're my top 2 pitchers, but on one-pitcher sites, I'll be going with Hamels. As for bats, you're going to need some value bats today. So I'm going to look at some guys, probably some Phillies bats, like Ben Revere, like a guy like maybe possibly Maikel Franco, if he's cheap on one of the sites. I know he's been kind of expensive. But I'll be waiting for lineups to come out. I'll be checking RotoCurve's lineup page and seeing some value bat today to match up with those guys. But I think Billy Burns, like you said, is one of those guys you got to plug in as long as his price is low. What are you doing today?
Yeah, well, like I said, I had been messing around with some Harvey and Bauer lineups earlier, so I'm probably gonna be looking a little bit more towards Hamels right now once I sign off here. Once we're on, toward using a little bit of Lance McCullers in there. There's a lot of big bats I want, guys like Fielder, who we mentioned, guys like Harper. I really want to try to fit those guys into a lineup, and it's tough to go Fielder, Harper, round out a lineup with guys that you really like. And, well, I had trouble doing it with Harvey and Bauer. I'm going to try it with Hamels and Bauer after this and see if that works out a little better for me on some of these 2-pitcher sites. Again, a guy like Kang, I think, is somebody who you really have to use. A guy like Billy Butler. I mean, these guys are really cheap and will allow you to get some of those bigger bats into your lineup on a day like today. So those are guys I think you definitely have to look at. Even Norris at catcher, like I said, I don't love the fact he's going up against Liriano, but he does smash left-handed pitching, and he's incredibly cheap. And you're going to need some of these guys. You're going to need to put some of these guys in your games if you're going to try to, use any decent pitching and still get some of these big bats. I always try to pay up at first base, so I don't want to be taking chances or having to come down at first base. So, Fielder's a guy who I think I'm going to be building around. I think the matchup's too good for him, and he's been too hot lately to mess around. So basically for my cash games, I'm going to be looking at guys like Bauer and probably Hamels. For the tournaments, I'm going to throw in a little bit of McCullers and see how many big bats I can get in there and see which of the value guys that we mentioned that we like that I can round it out with.
That sounds like a good plan. I'll be doing something of the same, especially in those tournaments with McCullers. But that pretty much brings us to the end of the show and the end of the week. We will see you next Tuesday, June 2nd at noon Eastern time. Be sure to check out myself at Josh Kalachi on Twitter and Benny at BennyR11, as well as the RotoCurve Twitter handle and all the tools you can find on RotoCurve. It's definitely a spot in my research and should be yours as well. Real quick, just want to say good luck to Benny. The next time we will be talking on Tuesday, you will be a father of 3. So good luck to you, the wife, and little Matt Carpenter Jr. over there.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, for those of you guys who don't know, my wife is expecting. We're going in Monday to deliver the baby. So I'll have a bouncing baby boy on Tuesday when I talk to you guys. So you'll see some big bags under my eyes. But other than that, nothing else really changes around here. Pretty much the same way as it's always been. So guys, I just want to say good luck tonight. Hopefully, if Josh or I don't win a lot of money, one of you guys takes something down. And as always, stay classy, DFS. We love you guys. Be good.